Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and today I have a great conversation for you. I have Gavin Ashenden with me, the former chaplain to the Queen. We are talking about Islam and its effect on Great Britain today. How are you doing, Gavin?
I'm doing very well, Connor. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too. So my sort of view of Islam and its effect on Britain from sort of an outside perspective is that it has grown artificially through immigration, and that because Muslims, when they, or sorry, basically when immigrants come in, they generally have more children based on the fact that they sort of haven't been corrupted the by modernity as much, especially if they're from sort of Asia or Africa, and and also the population of Britain is not growing as fast amongst English and Scottish and Welsh. So it seems to me that there's a real threat that Islam could possibly become a dominant force, or even already is, through influence. Is that kind of how it is?
Yes, I think so. I mean, we need to tidy up some of the things you've said in broad outline. Let me just say that for the last 25 years or so, the left and liberals have been laughing at me and others, saying, you're clearly phobic and frightened and irrational, and you can't count. Because all this talk about a dominant Islamic culture is nonsense. Look how few of them there are. But I think the phrase demography is destiny is obviously right. And if nothing changes, and then again, my leftish friends say, but things do change. So with that caveat, if nothing changes, there'll be a Muslim majority somewhere between 250 and 270. Muhammad is already by far the most prevalent boy's name in the country. And so it seems unlikely that the numbers can grow from a few million to half the population. But that is the trajectory, and this isn't just an anxiety from people who like their own culture, who are conservatives, who like to conserve what is good about our own culture. Again, the left and multiculturalism have done a very profound psychological job on people who quite understandably um, want to conserve their own place. Anti-colonialism only works one way, it seems, against the whites and against Western culture. But the reason this is concerning is because we have these three main cultural streams, I suppose: Christianity and post-Christianity. By post-Christianity, I mean a society borrowing its ethics mainly from Christendom. And then we have secular society, which wants to make its own ethics, and then we have Islamic society. Now, the leftists have always thought that Islam would give way in the same way that Christianity has. They're very badly educated, and they imagine Islam is a form of Arabic Judeo-Christianity. They don't realize, for example, that Islam is a hybrid between politics and religion of a very sophisticated kind. And perhaps they don't also know from history that only once in history, I think, has Islam ever been rolled back from countries where it became a majority in, and that would be after the Convivencia in Spain, when the Spanish took up arms and forcibly ejected Muslims from society. So if you take those as facts, and they are facts, well, apart from my suggestion that Islam is of a different constituent nature than Christianity, well, that's a fact too. Then one of the things we're faced with is a very rapidly changing Europe, and I would say a rapidly changing America. I think, for example, in terms of what's happened in Gaza and Israel, the way in which in America the whole populist response under 30 has been so profoundly pro-Palestinian. without, it seems, anyone understanding what the issues were. I mean, it wouldn't be so bad if you had people pro-Palestinian by informed conviction. They'd be entitled to do that. But it's when it's done by ignorance, and the chanting from the river to the sea is made by people who don't know what river and can only vaguely guess at what sea, um, and, and are calling for genocide. Uh, as people have said, the difference between the Nazis and the Palestinian Muslims is that the Nazis were ashamed about their genocide of the Jews, whereas the Palestinian Muslims are quite the opposite, which again it raises moral questions that we're entitled to ask. So the problem that we face in this country and in Europe, and perhaps in America, though I think the demographics are different there, is what is going to happen when Islamic culture begins to predominate. Firstly, in certain cities, it will be patchy, it'll be urban, and then secondly, more widely. And in case one wanted an imaginative story writer's examination of the issues, then Michel Houellebecq, which is a name that's almost as difficult to say as it is to spell, was a Frenchman, I think a Belgian perhaps, who wrote on the day that his book was published on the day of the Charlie Hebdo murders in Paris, an imagined scenario in France where, of the 10 million Muslims there, they decide to start an Islamic party. So that's one of the next things that will happen in European politics. At the moment, Islam votes with the left because there's an alliance between the left and Islam, both for different reasons, which will break down quite soon. I mean, the point where it begins to break down already is Queers for Palestine, when the queers who are for Palestine would, if they went there or in some other Islamic countries, be thrown off the top of high buildings for being queer, having no sense at all of the political incongruity of their value system. So, I mean, that's the extreme point at which that alliance has broken down, but it'll break down more and more. And what I think we're going to see in England is a form of apartheid. At least I hope we're going to see a form of apartheid, because only with a form of social apartheid can Christian culture be saved from the creeping expansion of Islamic culture. In other words, if we have, for example, 8 or 10 cities that are majority Muslim, and they say, well, we would like to govern ourselves by Sharia law, which they would be entitled to do if you're a Democrat, if that's your primary value, then other parts of the country will say, well, we don't want Sharia law, and therefore you will have a form of apartheid between cities that are governed by majority Muslims following some aspect of Sharia law and other parts of the country that aren't. Well, we have models for this already. Lebanon is one. It's not a happy model. And the reason it's not happy is because there's no evidence in history that Islam makes an easy neighbor to live with. You have to give them their credit, which is that they are colonialist and expansionist and missionary, and they are committed to a thorough Islamification of any society that they're part of. And in that respect, Christians should give them respect. So should we be.
Indeed. There's a lot there. I would say that in America, things are more likely to be Hispanicized or Hispanified in America than Islamified. So in that sense, though, unfortunately, there tends to be many Hispanics that come to America and then they become Protestant, but there is a theoretical chance of a Catholicization of America more than Islamification of America through demographics, at least. And then along the lines of, so you said how the Spanish achieved the ridding of Islam from Spain. Does Britain, because a lot of these people, majority of the Muslims that have come to actually, I think only like 3% of Muslims maybe are native English. Does Britain need to take a page out of the playbook of the Reconquista?
Well, I'm afraid it's a horrible question. You'd rather not be asked. It's a very difficult ethical question for a Christian because, um, left to myself, I would say I'm a citizen of the kingdom of heaven before I'm a nationalist. I I think I might have been a nationalist 30 years ago, but I can't see any nation that I'm part of now that I would want to fight for. I mean, I think English society has been so sufficiently multiculturalized that the society I grew up in. I mean, if you look, for example, at video of London in the 1950s and 60s when I was a child, the past is indeed a different country. It's completely different. Would I have fought for that one? I think I probably would. My father did. Would I fight for this one? There's nothing to fight for. I think the die is past. I might struggle energetically to keep the place I live as Christian as possible, but I don't think there's any prospect at all of armed struggle. I mean, one of the reasons is that, the English. I mean, let's just say in some fantasy land that the army hadn't been completely wokeified like the American army has. The army is about 60,000 people. At Eid in Birmingham, something like about 80,000 young men of military age who are Muslim gather together. No politician would ever call upon the army to fire upon Muslims. So,
Well, I wasn't thinking so much. I was just thinking deportation. Since they immigrated here, they theoretically can be immigrated out. That's what I mean.
well, I may have jumped the gun a bit to even kind of have a pun, but immigration would only happen by force. It wouldn't happen voluntarily.
Well, yeah, but like, I mean, just as deportation, sort of
Deportation.
deportation is illegal. Is it not a legal right to every country?
Well, only if there's a sense of national identity and any will. There are
Okay.
no politicians. I mean, there are literally no politicians
I mean, you do have a
who
Hindu prime minister, and in Scotland there is a Muslim first minister.
and a Muslim mayor of London and another
Oh,
18
that's
Muslim mayors throughout our large conurbations. But there are no politicians who could even conceive of that as a solution. And even if there were politicians who could conceive of it, we live in a country where, I don't know, I read today that something like 10% of people are longing to be locked down for fear of COVID. Uh, I know.
that's
they
so
want the
that's so
they want the
sad.
rule they want the rule of six reappeared. So that they want the state to ban anyone meeting more than five people. So I think that's what I meant by saying there's no country to fight for.
Okay.
The country I grew up in has been changed so drastically; it doesn't exist anymore. And anyway, even if that was the case, I think I'm quite glad to be spared the ethical issue of whether or not, as a Christian, I should take up arms in order to fight and kill other people for a country. I don't think that's what Jesus wants. I think I'm probably, but it's very difficult to know because, if the Spanish had done that, then you'd have more. So, at what point, if my father hadn't picked up arms to fight the Nazis, we'd have, a particular kind of Nazi country. So it's the whole issue of whether Christians should pick up arms is a very, very complicated one, and I'm afraid I'm simply not clear in my own mind at what point my responsibility, uh, as a citizen, would stretch that far.
Do you think age has a lot to do with this? I think younger people have a stronger desire to fight for their to sort of retain the culture.
I'd say the opposite. I would say that there's a kind of divide between probably 50 and under. People aged 50, have been better educated and have got a memory of when society, of not being brainwashed by education or by multiculturalism. I think people under 45, there are very few of them, who have any sense of value beyond the ones that they were forced to accept by their education and that they've experienced. So I don't find very many people under 45 have any vision for a changed society. In fact, most of them appear to want, something more totalitarian and
Mm.
more communist. Again, they have no sense of the incredible, as both Peterson and Rod Dreher talk about. They have no sense at all of the ruthlessness of socialism and Marxism and the human toll once it begins to impose its will. There's a terrible naivety, I mean, a deliberately constructed naivety amongst Western children who are now under the age of 40.
I do think that sort of a strong man is more and more popular amongst young people these days, but I think that comes from the fact that we weren't told how. I maybe this is different in England, but we weren't really told how to live a good life. So we almost need somebody to tell us how to live a good life.
Well, I mean, that's partly the history of of nationalism and fascism in Europe in the 1930s, in the face of the collapse of economies and the collapse of nations, or the threats to nation states. 2 or 3 strong men arose. I mean, obviously Franco, Mussolini, and Hitler, the obvious ones. And they're 3 very different people. And the 3 fascisms of Europe, German fascism, Italian, and Spanish, again, were 3 very different ideologies, despite the fact they're lumped under one label. So it's certainly true that when crises come, people turn for a political messiah. That's part of human nature. I just hate to think what kind of political messiah might emerge in the present circumstances, though in one sense Trump may be part of a response to that profound psychological anxiety. But we'll have to see at the next election. That would be colorful.
Yeah. Also, Islam hasn't just sort of been growing amongst the people, and Sharia law, isn't just possibly coming through, but there was a situation where the Quran was read at I believe, was it an Anglican service a couple years ago. So it's sort of seeping into Christians.
Well, this was an expression of a rather ignorant form of interreligious dialogue. Although I was part of it, I mean, for about 20 years, I was part of this whole culture which looked at Judaism, Christianity, Islam as the Abrahamic cousins. I now realize historically and theologically that's complete nonsense. But I had to read my way into Islam quite some way before I discovered that. So in those days, there was a sense that, well, since the Quran contained references to Abraham and to David and to Miriam, Mary, and to Isha, Jesus, and Joseph, then surely there was more, at least as much in common as there was different. But the fact is that Muhammad created these personas out of nowhere. The fact they have the same name, if someone with your name cloned your identity and in Peru and said, I'm Connor, you'd say, you may have the same name as me and the same identity card, but actually you're somebody very different. You're not the same despite the same name. And the same is true with these religious figures in the Quran and the Bible. They may have the same name. They're not the same character or the same person. They were constructed on purpose by Muhammad to provide a superior overlap in the Quran for a prophetic tradition that he was jealous of and wanted to give expression to himself. So one of the things that happened was that a rather ignorant Scottish dean, who happened to be as homosexual as he was ignorant, which is very in both cases, decided that he would replace St. Paul in the Anglican Feast of the Epiphany in Glasgow Cathedral with a reading from the Quran. And I guess probably, since I don't imagine he's very well read, certainly not in the Quran and absolutely not in Arabic, he invited the Muslims to provide the reading for him. And they did him proud. They found one of the most offensive readings in the whole Quran, the surah that says God doesn't have a son. So here on the Feast of the Epiphany, where the wise men come from all the religions, and Christianity celebrates the fact that all deep wisdom longs for Jesus, the Muslims invited to this service as an act of interfaith hospitality said, "Yeah, no, that's rubbish." And so I read about it. I thought this has nothing to do with me. It was in a separate province. Scotland's a different ecclesiastical province to England. But the students who knew about me in Glasgow, who went to Glasgow Cathedral, wrote to me because they were better educated than the dean, and they said you shouldn't have done this. These 21-year-olds, whereupon he reported them to the police for homophobia, on the grounds he said that challenging his judgment was quite clearly a homophobic hate crime, and they ought to be prosecuted and be sent to prison for it. So that was a point when they wrote to me and said, "We're having a really tough time here. Any chance you'd give us a hand?" So at that point, I wrote about it in the Times quite critically, and that was a very creative watershed for me, but it was one that I'm very glad happened. And of course, it changed nothing. And this silly man, it wasn't intended to change anything. It was intended to draw attention to the religious stupidity of it, which at least it did. So that was just an example of the ignorance of the interfaith communities and the way in which they talk to one another and misunderstand each other's religions and precepts.
I'm not even sure you could say that dean is Christian, though. I mean, just the way you describe him, he doesn't seem to know what he believes.
Well, he's certainly not Christian in any sense that I would define it. But the problem is that how you define the word Christian. But I mean, essentially, I would have thought that as he's a good example of progressive Christianity, which is, I would say, so sub-Christian as indeed not to be a Christian, maybe even be anti-Christian.
A good example of a bad example.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there are lots like him in liberal Protestantism. In fact, it's made up of people who share his views. They don't believe in heaven and hell. They don't believe that sexuality is a matter of moral purity. They don't believe in the uniqueness of Jesus. And they are, on the whole, relativists rather than absolutists. So none of these are expressions of classic or orthodox historic Christianity. So that would be why people like me would not call them Christian.
Has there been any sort of polling or demographic look at how many Christians in England actually believe in Christianity, like a real Christianity?
Well, we know how many people go to church in the Church of England. It's about 600,000 people on a Sunday. It's a tiny proportion of a population. It must be about 70 million. And of those, I would think 70% would probably be progressive, because the Catholics have left. There are very few Anglo-Catholics anymore, and so there'd be probably maybe 30% evangelicals, and then that's the Anglicans. There are a few other Protestants. There's some Pentecostals, about 600,000 Orthodox who believe, and probably somewhere between 2 and 4 million Catholics. Hard to know the quality of Catholic belief amongst those numbers, but I would put it at higher rather than lower. And in fact, one of the things I've been saying for some time is that it's time that we got over the historical sense of Catholic disability in this country from having been excluded by a pretty vicious establishment that spent quite a lot of time burning and disemboweling priests in the 16th century and then excluding them for the next 200 years from all professional walks of life. Now Catholics are constitute the greatest number of Christians in this country, and I'd like to see both Catholic laity and Catholic clergy take the responsibility for that position. But at the moment, they still seem to be fairly historically and culturally battered and timid. But I think that ideally ought to change.
Yeah. What was the mindset of the time when they started sort of importing Muslims into the United Kingdom? Because it seems to me that on the face from a historical perspective, Islam seems like sort of a long-standing rival or enemy to Christianity. So what was sort of why did this happen? Why was this who started this?
I'm afraid I think that's a really complicated question, and I don't really know the answer. I mean, it's clearly a mixture of factors. One is that Muslims wanted to come to the West, which is rather odd. But they want to come to the West for the benefits of the society, but they were fleeing an Islamic society to come here. So there's a contradiction involved in that, which I think is one of the reasons why the left thought they could be secularized and sexualized. They came partly because of falling birth rates and the need for an economy to be driven by immigration. But it wasn't done sensibly or with any sense of responsibility. There are other places in the world that have done. Both Canada and Australia developed much more sophisticated immigration point systems where they said, well, we recognize we want an influx of people, but these are the kind of people we want. That's never happened in England in any particular way at all. So I'm afraid it's mainly incompetence. I mean, the tectonic pressures of mobile societies, the lure of the standard of living in the West, and complete incompetence and ignorance by our politicians. And maybe since we get the politicians we deserve, complete incompetence and ignorance of the British people. But that's not. But I will say that I've spent most of my life saying to my communities, it would be far better to be Christian than non-Christian, and a great deal better to be Christian than to be Muslim. But you can't. All you can do is say these things in public and hope that people can hear.
The British Empire, one of the reasons a lot of these immigrants came into the country was because, from what I understand, because of the British Empire and its connections to someplace like Pakistan. Like this opened up, that's why there's a number, from my understanding, there's a lot of Hindus and a lot of Pakistanis from India and Pakistan because of the connections with the empire.
Yes, people had the right. In fact, many of them were British citizens, and they had the right to come to Britain. They had British passports. So although the ups and downs or the benefits and vices of colonialism are much debated, and people like Nigel Biggar or the African Anglican Archbishop of York say that in their opinion there were at least as many benefits as vices. One of the benefits was certainly that a good number of people who were not indigenous Caucasians had political access to come here and did come here.
And also, one of the sort of one of the negatives that has come from this is that there have been, the government, from what I understand, has sort of covered up gangs that have attacked women in England over the past years.
Well, I think that's separate. I mean, it's obviously related in the sense that the gangs are immigrant gangs, but I'm afraid at this point I would blame not the immigrants, but I mean obviously the people who did it to blame, but I would blame racism and the whole notion of thought crime. One of the things I'd like to do, though I don't think I dare do it, is to try and raise the question that all thought crime is pernicious and essentially illusory. That's not to say that there aren't racist or there isn't racism, but I'm not sure racism is what people think it is. I mean, certainly for a start, if you're anti-Islam, if you don't like Islam, people assume that's a branch of racism, when obviously Muslims are made up of so many different races it can't possibly be. But what they really mean by racism is you don't like your neighbor. And one thing reasons I would like to get rid of the idea of racism is it's terribly inaccurate. Christians already got a very carefully refined notion of what it is to sin against your neighbor, whether your neighbor is taller than you or darker than you or more stupid than you or cleverer than you. We already have that as a sin in a much more interesting way than to do with how much melanin you've got in your skin, which is a really stupid stupid way of distinguishing between people, given the gradation of skin color. I mean, it's just incompetent. But unfortunately, because the left have been pushing racism so hard, everyone is now terrified of being thought racist, made worse by the fact that nobody knows what racism is because you can't define it. And so the very, very stupid police who had the responsibility for defending these indigenous girls who were being gang raped and molested did nothing because they were afraid of being criticized for being racist if they took any action against the immigrant communities who were behaving in this highly criminal and perniciously immoral way. And that's just, I mean, it's just so unbelievably stupid and immoral as to almost be beyond belief, but that's what's happened to our society. So again, I mean, it's an example of why would I want to fight for any society characterized by that kind of category error and stupidity? We're past saving, I'm afraid. So I worry if, I mean, I'll be dead soon. Well, we'll all be dead soon, but I'll be dead sooner than some. So I worry for my children, but all I can say is I've done the best I can. And I couldn't do, there's nothing more I could do apart from educate my children and take part in public debate on behalf of Christ and Christianity, which I've done. But there are good times and bad times in history. I've been very privileged to live through a very good time. I've been very lucky or blessed, whichever language you use. But I think we're about to enter a much more disruptive period, a much more dystopian period of human history, partly because of the triumph of these ideas and the weakness and insipidness of the Christianity that much of my generation followed, to its shame.
Do you think the good period that you're talking about was kind of a mirage, though? Because from what I can tell, is there the underlying problems of the last 30, 40 years is just easier to see now.
Well, it depends what you. So I understand what you're saying, but again, I'd use a different framework. I would say that there are periods in society where it's comfortable in your civilization, and the comfort is that there's not much warfare, not much disease, not much hunger. And one of the things that one of the myths that people have been taken in by is that progress is unstoppable. In fact, I think there are other periods of life where society was far more beautiful and attractive. And I would put the late Middle Ages. It's crazy people use the word medieval as a pejorative term. Look at the building, look at the intellectual thought, look at the religious life, look at the way in which the monks and the nuns and the monasteries provided all the social care. Look today at the level of mental illness and stress and confusion, the lack of belonging, the psychological terror of our society. So I think I lived through a period when there wasn't any war where I lived, and there was a great deal to eat and drink, and there was medicine, and that was a very, very great blessing. But people who believe in the myth of progress imagine it will continue, and it won't continue. I think we're heading towards really a number of serious collapses. And I don't mean the ecological disaster. I think the ecological disaster is a form of social manipulation to take people's minds off something else. I haven't quite worked out what that something else is. But when we're not allowed to talk about both sides of the science, we're not allowed to talk about the political implications of what we're being force-fed, there's clearly something else. Other people's interests are trying to terrify us with a form of apocalypticism that effectively drives us into a different religion, that of placating Gaia, placating what is effectively a fertility goddess, the earth, and surrendering our rights and our responsibilities to other people to keep us safe. I mean, in COP28, politicians on small islands, which are only just above the sea, are screaming, we're all going to die. But they were saying that 20 years ago and 30 years ago, and there's been no great change in sea level at all. That doesn't mean there isn't going to be one, but equally there could be a satellite, not a satellite, a comet that could hit the Earth and cause mass devastation that could create another ice age. We're almost certainly heading towards another ice age more than we're heading towards global warming. And if anything is keeping us from that, it's CO2, whether it's man-made or not man-made. And nobody appears to know, since there are issues to do with the sun. Not that I'm at all comfortable with human pollution. I think human pollution is disgusting, and there are things that we've done to the earth that are abominable and should be dealt with. But they're more to do with plastic and destroying the viability of water than they are of CO2 and runaway global warming. So I don't think we're given the right information. I'm not sure when we are given the right information, we can use it. Much of the computer modeling appears to be completely bizarre and unreliable. And I suspect there's some political motivation underneath, but it's not clear what it is. However, it's not WYSIWYG. What you see is definitely not what you get.
Interesting. Yeah. Do you think you mentioned sort of the possibility of future there being like a Islam party, a Muslim party within politics? Because if from my perspective, I almost think like at least they're like if they were to start a Islam party, you then see it right in front of you, and it could, there's something to galvanize against, if you know what I mean. Do you think that would be more useful than actually hurt to the public at the moment?
Well, I know that if I was a Muslim, I'd want to hide the prospect of a Muslim party for as long as possible, because the point at which it becomes viable is the point where it will frighten people when they see what the implications are. So at the moment, there's a strategy to keep that from the public. The difficulty is that the democracy is such a blunt and incompetent way of managing our lives. It's just that everything else is worse. I mean, there's no right wing there is no conservative political tradition left anymore. It's just a matter of how far left you go. With, I think, Nazism that was a Freudian slip. I think with Islamism, and some people have described it as Islamofascism, which looked like an insult until one saw what happened in Gaza, whereupon I think Islamofascism is exactly the right term. So the moderate right, or the conservative, those who would conserve the indigenous tradition, have been wiped out by education and cultural polemicists, leaving only versions of the very dangerous left, and a very dangerous Islamic right. And that's going to be really quite a tough place for people to be politically, I think.
Yeah. There's something it makes me so disappointed to see British culture dying, because I pretty much all my favorite authors are from the British Isles, and it seems like the quality there is just so immense that it really is quite sad to.
Oh, I agree, but the answer is to buy books, buy physical books, and keep them. I mean, both Huxley and Orwell, in their great dystopian books, foresaw British European culture disappearing and being eviscerated and forbidden. That's already happening. I mean, they're changing the books retrospectively. They're changing the language in them. They're no longer the same books, and they're even changing J.K. Rowling. The only answer is to buy books and hide them and give them to your children. That's the way in which we'll have access to our culture. But I think
How are they changing J.K. Rowling?
Editors are changing. They're wokeifying both plots and people, changing pronouns and
Wait,
removing.
in the original books?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, mainly books of my childhood.
Okay.
Children's books from my childhood, but even way after my childhood. So I heard there was 1970s. There was a very well-known author whom I didn't read, but other people loved. What was his name? It'll come back. But I mean, the editors are changing and republishing books right up to the millennium and beyond.
Yeah, they don't want to keep history. History is history is an offense to them.
History is dangerous because it offers different values, and we're moving into a totalitarian culture where the different values must be suppressed in case people choose them.
Also, like the way they deal with censorship, the way they deal with crushing old culture, it's, in my opinion, it seems like it's inevitable that it will have a backlash, and I'm not really sure. I don't think they'll be pleased with the backlash, and I don't think we'll necessarily be happy with the backlash, because it probably won't be pretty.
Yes, I don't know. I'm afraid I think the power struggle is lost.
Okay.
So I think if you're talking about a backlash, what you're talking about is describing a degree of protest. I can think of a lot of people who might want to protest about what's coming, but whether they succeed or not, I think unlikely. But just because I think, well, I mean, again, the internet has been terrifyingly effective of producing similar outlooks around the world. The internet's been very effective in producing a monochrome psychological and value system that people are terrified of being excluded from.
But it also at the same time connects people like you and me.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. It is both the best and the worst of all things. Yes, it allows, it creates the most disgusting kinds of pornography and allows the very best kinds of conversation. In a sense, it's the theological dilemma writ large, because that's what free will does. It produces both the very worst and the very best under God.
Well, do you think the very best, as long as somebody like Elon Musk hopefully keeps control over these he bought Twitter, which is now X, and he has opened it up and really I guess kept allowed the good, and I mean he allows some of the bad too. There's plenty of bad on there as well, but everywhere else the good is being eroded. So at least there's something there.
Yes, I mean this is the theological principle behind what love wins is aiming at, but missing. I mean, it's God wins. God wins because He's made human beings in His own image, and we're restless until we find our rest in Him, as Augustine said. So one of the reasons for being not optimistic, for having a theology of hope for Christians, is that human beings don't like hell, most of them, and they won't be comfortable in the hell they've made for themselves. And every so often there'll be figures who respond and resonate to the good, as I think Musk has done in some respects. I've certainly become a great fan of his and pray for him, and I'm very grateful to him.
It's also strange because he seems like he's kind of woken up only within the last couple of years.
Well, it took me till I was in my mid-50s to wake up, so he's way ahead of me.
But he is the richest man in the world.
Poor man, what a terrible burden. What an awful burden.
I would not want to be the richest man in the world, certainly. He has to make a whole lot of decisions that I don't think any of us would want to deal with.
Absolutely right.
It makes me think of just the story about the rich man having trouble getting through the eye of the needle, which I don't know if you've heard this. I've heard that it was the name of a gate in Jerusalem. Have you heard that?
Oh yes, indeed I have. But whichever way you tell the story, it's still true.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yes.
So the question, was Jesus using a metaphor from everyday architectural life? Maybe he was. Was he, or was he just using the biggest thing and the smallest thing known to the human eye? It doesn't. It still means that the richer you are, the harder it is to let go your ego. But the wonderful news is, with God, nothing is impossible. Even rich people can be saved.
Yeah, I like to think about it as in like you'd have to abandon all your things. Like in that with that gate, you'd have to abandon all your things. You'd have to go in by yourself, and
Yeah,
that's basically the only way. And people say it's similar to the you can't take the things of the world with you. It's very similar to that.
it is. So many of the things that Jesus said were self-evidently true but he applied them in a way with him at the center and inviting people to literally to wake up. I mean, salvation is also a process of waking up, which is why the woke always take Christian ideas and then pervert them. They're parasitic upon the goodness, the beauty, and the truth. Evil can't create; it always has to borrow and twist out of shape.
I mean, from what I can tell, like Marxism and socialism came from. I like to think that those two came from sort of Catholic cultures looking for fixes to the Industrial Revolution, and then liberalism came out of Protestant culture mainly. Do you think?
Yes,
Would you?
I think you make an argument for saying that. Liberalism has changed a great deal.
Mhm.
It's not what it thought it was, but it's certainly the case that Marxism is a Christian heresy, as all utopians on the whole are Christian heresies. We're designed for heaven. We'll get to heaven by dying, but impatient people think that they can create heaven on earth, which will, of course, inevitably require force and therefore a lot of torture and killing. So
Every dystopia.
yeah, yeah,
Every dystopia is brought about by trying to create a utopia,
right.
which interesting enough, utopia, from my understanding, doesn't mean good place, it means no place.
Absolutely. That was why Thomas More, who wrote one of the first treatises of it, chose the word.
And
It was meant to be a joke. This place doesn't exist. It's nowhere.
yeah, and then my understanding, Marx read that and was like, he makes good points. Like as if like it's possible.
Yes, I'm afraid. There's a great deal wrong with Marx, not just his economics.
Yeah, but like how can you think satire is actually the answer to your problem?
Well, the left don't understand satire. They have no sense of humor, so they usually miss most of the truth that lies beneath satire.
Yeah, they're missing the whole point of life, just as they miss the whole point of Christianity.
Yeah,
They always take sort of the most uh, almost useless aspects that like only work in tandem with everything else, but they take it out and then they try and use it for their own uh, benefit or for their own use. This is what like a lot of quote unquote Christian politicians often use. They'll use their faith somehow to uh, argue for anything remotely opposite, such as like abortion or anything like that.
they will.
All of this is malformed Christianity, and then you have sort of this. I mean, Islam in some sense is malformed Christianity too. I mean, it's not exactly. It's as I like to say, it's what you would imagine a religion that is taken from sort of Zoroastrianism and the sort of the what you think Christianity and Judaism are saying, put into practice by a uh, pedophile warlord.
Yes, all that's true.
And then of course, what does a warlord do to gain power? He promises people you know immense wealth and pleasure, and then he conquers at every place he can get to.
Yep.
And that's basically what you're dealing with, like, but this was imported by Westerners for what reason I don't understand. Maybe because they thought, oh, we want more people from we want diversity, even though I don't think that's what they would have said, like 20, 30 years ago, would they? They wouldn't have said we need diversity.
No, diversity is a trick derived by the Frankfurt School in order to bring about an exchange of power relations. Um, I mean, that doesn't mean what it says, but I think we should also say that, to be fair, that Islam has a great deal of good in it. It's just that it has a great deal of good culturally and philosophically, and to some extent spiritually. It certainly has a discipline that many Christians lack. But the problem is that Allah is not Yahweh. Allah is uh, a non-negotiating moral force whom you cannot know and be in relationship with. And so this changes our understanding of what it is to be a human being. There's something much more instrumentalist about being a human being in Muslim culture than there is within Judeo-Christian culture, where we're made in the image of God, whom we're invited to know and love and be loved by. It's a very different picture. That doesn't make everything in Islam wrong any more than it makes everything in Christianity virtuous. The trouble is both these systems are inhabited by people, and people can both enrich and despoil depending on what caliber people they are. But if you have to choose, ultimately, I think one of the most sensible ways is to talk about choosing between Muhammad and Jesus. In whose company would you want to be? Who would you want to be judged by? Who would you want to be saved or constrained by? And for me, it's an absolute no-brainer. I've been profoundly in love with Jesus ever since I discovered who he was, and I've never been anything but well, I have a number of responses to Muhammad, moving from respect of what he achieved to profound mistrust and alarm at what he's likely to do. So I think one of the things we should do as Christians is to say that if you're choosing between Marx, Muhammad, and Jesus, Jesus is much the better and more attractive bet.
Indeed. I mean, as I described Muhammad, I don't think you'd want to pick that description as the person you want to follow.
Well, except if you were a Muslim, you would, to be fair to Muslims, they could do a much better job of presenting an attractive character than you did. You didn't try very hard.
Well, I really wasn't trying. I think those are the most important aspects, at least in denoting the character of Muhammad. Of course, they would disagree.
I think we have to do better than that. I
Okay.
don't think we want to win an argument by being unfair or by being underinformed. Muhammad must have been the most extraordinary person. But if we're going to exercise discernment, I think what's most interesting is the spiritual life behind him. So to my mind, he was clearly somebody who instinctively, intuitively, spiritually had access to a range of spiritual experience. That is assuming he existed and assuming he wrote the Quran. And these actually are, these are not, they're not as obvious assumptions as they might seem at first sight. The Quran didn't appear until 200 years afterwards. And there's some really quite interesting theories about how it emerged. But it's very unfair because the German higher scholarships claimed some very rude things about the Christian scriptures, which were just completely untrue, but might apply to the Quran. Well, but they'd never have applied to the Quran because the Quran has never made itself accessible to that kind of intellectual investigation. But if Muhammad existed in the form we're told he did, and if he constructed the Quran, he must have been a very interesting person. But my understanding is that he lacked the capacity to tell the difference between holy spirits and unholy spirits. And even there, I don't hold that particularly against him, since I spent the whole of my life trying to develop that facility as well. And it's not as easy as it seems. It's called the charism of discernment in Christianity. But I don't think there's any point in disrespecting Muhammad. I think we should pity him, but hold him accountable for what flowed from his teaching, and that's an awful lot of death.
How about, to be fair to him, maybe let's and you can tell me, you know more about Islam than I do, but if we compared someone from the Bible to Muhammad, would Solomon be something of a character comparable?
I think the person who's most comparable would probably be Moses.
Moses, really?
Uh,
Because,
well,
like,
well,
I mean, Solomon was much. I mean, Moses, from my understanding, is he's in heaven, and Solomon was corrupted almost utterly by.
yes, I
Yeah.
don't mean like. I don't mean like as in personality or virtue.
Okay.
I mean like as in type. So
Okay.
what did Moses do? Moses took a people from nowhere, effectively, and created a people in the promised land and gave them a whole load of rules to live by. Well, Muhammad did something really very similar to that.
Okay.
It's just that Moses really did get them from God, and I don't think Muhammad did. I think that some of the the Quran is a very complex mixture. It's made much more difficult by the fact it's in Arabic and is therefore much more difficult to get your head around if you don't speak Arabic, and I don't. So I have some Greek and some Hebrew, but I don't have any Arabic. But the problem still is that there's an incongruous mixture of ethics in the Quran that really doesn't make sense. It doesn't hang together as a theological work. It doesn't even hang together to reflect a single deity, because there are some rather beautiful bits in the Quran and some extremely ugly bits. So then, if they both, if those are both a true reflection of the deity, that means the ultimate reality is profoundly confusing and conflicted. Well, I think that's most unlikely. So I don't think the Quran is a reflection of ultimate reality. In which case, it's a composite mixture of truth and error. So then we have to decide what is the truth and what is the error. But why do that when you have the Gospels and you have the Logos? You have Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life. I can't see much need to spend time on Muhammad as a less competent prophetic figure when we have Jesus and all the real prophets.
Indeed, yeah, that's very well said. It is interesting, just also like Islam, like made itself all the way to the doors of France. Many years ago, probably like at least 1,000 or
Well,
more, probably.
from the south and west, it made its way to France at the Battle of Tours in
Yes.
about the 6th century, and then from the east and south, it made its way to Vienna
Yeah.
in the 16th century. So Islam has been banging on the doors of Europe to take it over by force for a very long time.
Really, the way they've done it is more so a invitation.
Yes, that's right. I mean, that seems to me to be part of the ignorance of European culture. I mean, the best example of that was Angela Merkel, who invited 1 million Syrian Muslim refugees in. The difficulty with this is that it's hard to know whether it's incompetence or conspiracy. In England, for example, 98% of the Syrian refugees who were given asylum here were Muslim, and that's a misrepresentation of the construction of Syrian society. There were quite a large number of Syrian Christians, but
yeah.
for reasons I don't understand, and one suspects conspiracy. What else could it be? Christian Syrians were kept out of Britain and not allowed asylum, but only Muslim Syrians were. Well, that suggests some level of social engineering from within our political system.
Especially with the threat on Christians in the Near East.
Yes, exactly. So again, I don't have any information, but it causes me concern and makes me suspicious.
Also, it just seems another element that lends itself to conspiracy is the fact that we basically set it up in the early 2000s where we'd go into the Middle East, the United States mostly, would go into the Middle East and create many wars, and then that would create the situation where there would need to be refugees.
Well, I'm afraid I'm a I'm a follower of Professor Mearsheimer, who's the best example of the realist historical tradition. And I've come to the conclusion that American foreign policy over the last 60 years has been completely disastrous to everybody and not well intentioned.
I agree completely. The U.S. Foreign policy has never been helpful to the United States and has never been helpful to the world. What?
Or to anybody else.
Yeah, exactly. It's literally been almost entirely useless. And there's a podcaster, a famous libertarian podcaster that likes to say that if you want to know who the United States' next enemies will be, look at the people we're currently funding.
Yes, I'm afraid that's true.
It's entirely true. Well, I think that's where we should leave it. Gavin, it's been a pleasure talking to you. You are wonderful, and your work is fantastic. So if you're not following Gavin's work, please go follow him on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. So, Gavin, is there anything coming up that you want to sort of plug?
No, I don't think so, except that my team of friends work under Catholic Unscripted, and we're on YouTube together as well. Please come and follow us and support the venture. We think we're an answer to Fulton Sheen's prophecy that there will come a point in the Catholic Church's life when the laity will have to take responsibility for a reinvigoration of Catholic vision, and we hope we're doing that, and we'd be glad to be supported. But Connor, thank you for your kind words. They're a reflection on your generosity of spirit more than they are on me. I'm very grateful. Thank you for your friendship. It's been great talking to you.
Well, thank you all for listening. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and God bless.